Hey, what's up? Welcome back. You're watching part 2 of 3 in a little mini series about asynchronous JavaScript programming. And in this episode, you'll learn all about promises. We're going to talk about the promise object. So let's open a brand new index.html file. And here we're just going to scaffold out some HTML. And I'm going to start off with just a script tag down at the bottom here, where we're going to talk about this promise object. So a promise is a type of object. It's a class, just the same way that we have a type of object for an array or a string or a map. This is another type of object that is available in the JavaScript API. And this gives us the ability to track the state of a job that is going to be either resolved or rejected. So a promise has 3 possible states. It's like pending, fulfilled, or rejected. So when a promise is pending, that's like it's an outstanding promise. We're waiting for something to happen. And in this example, I wanted to talk about this promise that I made to my kids. They want to go to this smoothie store that's right down the street, and they want to get some smoothies or these like blended drinks. And so I said, I promise that I will take you to the smoothie store. And while that promise is waiting for us to actually go to the smoothie store, there's a bunch of other stuff that's happening. Maybe we're working, maybe we're sleeping, exercising, whatever. During all of that time, the promise is pending. Okay, and then if we actually go and get smoothies, then the promise is fulfilled. If we don't actually go get smoothies and I change my mind and I'm like, you guys have been awful kids and you don't deserve smoothies, then the promise might be rejected. It's good to keep your promises if you are an adult and you're making promises to children. You don't want to give them, issues. But in that case, your promise might be rejected. Okay, so while a promise is pending, that means we're sort of waiting for something to come back. When a promise is fulfilled, that means the thing has been done. And when a promise is rejected, that means that some error happened, something failed, it didn't actually resolve in the way that you want. Wanted. Now, fulfilled and rejected, sometimes we'll talk about promises either being fulfilled or rejected and calling that settled. So settled is the same thing as fulfilled or rejected. So if the promise is settled, then it was either something happened, party's over, the promise was either broken or it was kept, and that's it. When you call the constructor function for the promise, so when we're saying new promise, this accepts an argument. And the argument to this function is another function that will execute immediately. And this function takes in 2 arguments. So it takes in a resolve or a reject. And these 2 functions, resolve and reject, are functions that you would call inside of your execution of this function. So we're going to call either resolve or reject or both inside of this function. If we call resolve, that means the promise was fulfilled. If we call reject, that means the promise failed for some reason. So here we could just say resolve with hello. And that would mean that as soon as the promise is created, it's resolved and it gets some value. So you will call resolve with the data that you want to resolve with, the data that is the resolution of the promise. You will call reject with some reason, failed to blah, blah, blah. Okay, so we can only call either resolve or reject. You can't call both. As soon as you call one of them, the promise will be either fulfilled or it will be rejected. You can't have both states. So maybe we say if true equals false, then we say hello, else we say reject. So what this will do is, because true is not equal to false, it will reject the promise. And then if we say is true equal to true, then it will resolve. And then otherwise, if true for some reason is not equal to true, then it will reject the promise. Usually, you would only use this new promise sort of syntax if you are authoring a library, a JavaScript library that other people are going to use. You typically would not actually write your own new promise function like this, but this is how promise functions actually work. And this gives us back this promise, this instance of a promise. So we'll say promise, promise 1. And for now, we'll console.log promise1 and see what we get back. See what this promise object looks like. So let's go refresh our browser and open up the console. And so we're going to refresh the page. And here inside of the console, we see that the promise, this is the status of the promise again. So it says fulfilled. And it gives us the data that it was fulfilled with right here. So right now we are successfully executing our promise. Now, if we were to comment out all of this content here and create a new promise that's not actually resolving or rejecting anything, and the function right now is just a no-op. A no-op means that it's a function that does nothing. So if we refresh the page, now we see a promise that has the state pending. So the promise is waiting to be resolved or rejected. So we actually have reference to promise1 because we defined it at like sort of the global level. So from the terminal here, I can actually mess around with promise1. So if I wanted to, I could say promise1.then or promise1.catch. And these are ways that we can add functionality that says once the promise is fulfilled, execute something, or when the promise is rejected, do something else. So let's go back over here and say if age is greater than 21, then we're going to resolve with like fancy smoothie if, let's see, like else if age is less than, or if the age is greater than 11, then we're going to resolve with just a normal smoothie. Otherwise, we're going to reject and like not allowed to have a smoothie. No smoothies for you. Okay. And then we need some reference to an age. So const age is, we'll start off with someone who deserves a fancy smoothie, and that's me, and I'm 31. I mean, I'm 34. I don't deserve a fancy smoothie, but that sounds delicious right now. The smoothie store is like, I call it the smoothie store. It's like the smoothie shop or whatever is seriously like a stone's throw or like a par 3 or I don't know. It's like right around the corner from us. And we've been living here for like 10 years and haven't actually gone and explored this shopping center. And so now this is like a new thing that we've been doing lately. Anyways, as soon as we execute this promise and create this promise, we will resolve with fancy smoothie, and we should see that that we are resolving with the fancy smoothie. But we need to talk about how we can add functionality that will respond to success or failure of this promise. The brand new JavaScript API that was released with promises sometime between 2015 and now has the .then and .catch syntax. So we can say promise1.then, and .then is a function that we're going to call, and we're going to pass in another function, and that will be the function that's called if the promise is resolved successfully. So we're going to pass in another function here. So we're going to say this is our success function. Also, now I'm like totally mixing and matching these. Tiny little sidebar. If you have function f that looks like this and it does stuff, that's the same as like, or that is very similar to having some variable f where we use this arrow syntax. So this parentheses with an arrow pointing at curly braces is another way to write a function call. And that's what I'm passing here. So this is like parentheses where it's accepting the parameters and arguments for a function. Then we're using the arrow function to pass in this. So this whole thing here is the body of the function that we're passing into promise. And that's going to execute again immediately. And then usually a promise is going to do some asynchronous thing. And then later on, it will resolve or reject. But in this case, we are going to immediately resolve or immediately reject based on the age. So what we can do is down here, we can pass in another function to then. And then we can say, inside we'll say console.log. And as part of our resolution, recall that we're passing in some data that is like the result of this promise that we made. So in the case of a promise to take the kids to the smoothie store, we might resolve with the type of smoothie here. So we're going to say fancy smoothie or normal smoothie. And that's going to be passed as an argument into .then. So here we're going to get like the like smoothie type or something. So we can console.log smoothie type. And that we should see that this logged to the console immediately, because as soon as our promise executes, it will be resolved. So it's going to be immediately resolved. And only later are we attaching this .then. So it turns out that you can call .then on a promise that is already resolved, that's already settled. So if you have a promise that's already fulfilled, so in fact, like if we recall that promise 1 at this point was already fulfilled. See, when we console log that, we see fulfilled here in the terminal. So that promise was already fulfilled, and we're then attaching some callback later that's executing when we call then. So there's a couple different syntaxes. When you call .then, you can pass it one function or you can pass it two functions. So if we pass it two functions, the second function will execute if there was a rejection. So we'll say reason here, and then we'll say console.error, and we'll pass in the reason. Okay, console.error will just make it red in the console. So in order to make this fail, let's say that we are actually 4 years old. We're not allowed to have smoothies. We refresh the browser, and now we see no smoothies for you. And this is red because we used console.error, and that is the reason of our rejection. Was this the reason that was passed to reject is what we receive as an argument to this second function that we're passing into then. So it turns out that you can continue to chain these the methods for .then and .catch. Okay, this style of calling then, where you pass in the first argument as the success callback and the second argument as the failure callback, is actually not that common. And there's a few different reasons for it, but a more common pattern is to, instead of passing a second argument, you call another function and you chain that onto .then, and we call it .catch. And this is where we pass in our error handler. We'll say console.error with our reason. And we'll talk about that in just a moment. So if we refresh now, we get the same result. We're still logging out no smoothies for you. But the difference is that usually when you're working with promises, it's nice to chain a bunch of different calls. So here we're saying, like, we have promise 1, and when promise 1 resolves, then do something. So we're console logging the smoothie type. And then you can say .then do something else. So maybe we want to say then, like, I don't know, you've got to, like, after you drink your smoothie, you're going to, I don't know, we'll like console log, then you're going to take a nap or something. Okay, so if we refresh the page, no smoothies for you because we did not successfully resolve. Let's say that we are 11, and we'll refresh. Oh, we have to be older than 11, so 12. We'll refresh. So we received a normal smoothie, so we drank a normal smoothie, and then we took a nap, and then it finished resolving all of these promises. So you can sort of chain these on. And what's really nice is with this arrow syntax, we can actually just remove a lot of these lines because these are all one-liners. And we can just do this here. And this makes it read very nicely, right? So you have your promise, you have your .then. And again, recall that like this .then is executing when we successfully resolve. And then this .then was going to be called after this then runs. So you can continue chaining these on and have as many thens as you want, and then you usually will have a catch at the end. All right, so you've got all these then calls, but if at some point during the execution of any of those subsequent calls results in an error, then our catch is going to be called. So for instance, if at this line, for some reason we said throw new error, like failed to fall asleep or something, then the execution is going to stop, and we're going to go into our catch. So this makes it really nice to add a bunch of thens and then automatically sort of handle the failure cases as you're working through a process of going through a list of errors. So here we see we drank a normal smoothie, then we tried taking a nap, and then we failed to fall asleep. That error was raised, and then we went down here to console.error. That's where we actually like failed and printed out failed to fall asleep. So that is pretty handy. Now there's a couple other things that I wanted to talk about. So usually, again, when you're using this promise, it is not going to be resolving immediately like ours is now. usually it's going to resolve in some time. So we're going to look back and use what we learned in the last episode about set timeout. And we're going to say that, let's actually use a set timeout here. And we're going to pass in another function that will run. And it takes some time to actually go to the smoothie store. So let's say that we actually want this to happen after 3 seconds. So we'll console.log that we're on our way. Okay. And then as we drive, it's gonna take us 3 seconds to drive to the smoothie store, and then we should see some output after that. So we're gonna refresh our page. We see that are on our way, and then we count 3 seconds. And then we get our normal smoothie, we take a nap, and then we fail to fall asleep. Okay, so let's take out our failure here, and let's take out some of these naps, and then refresh the page. So we're on our way. While we're on our way, we're counting down that 3-second timer. When the 3 seconds elapses, then we call resolve. When we call resolve, that ends up executing all of the .thens that were successfully added to our promise. And then ultimately, if there was any exceptions, it's going to call catch. What's cool about this is we still have access to promise 1, and it's fulfilled. But we could just in the console or any time at some later date, we could say .then, we're going to console.log, I want another smoothie. So I don't know how long it takes for you to want another smoothie, but we could add a .then to our fulfilled promise at a later date, and it would continue to call the .then. So you can attach these later. So that's kind of handy. All right, let's take a look at a more real world example of using a promise that's already built in. So the fetch API, I'm actually just going to comment all of this out so that we can keep it for later. So fetch is a method that's built into the browser that will return a promise. Now fetch takes in some arguments to make an API call or to make an HTTP request from the client on the browser to some server, to some remote server. And when it gets the data back from that server, then it will resolve the promise if it successfully got some data back, or it will reject the promise if that request failed. So let's go take a look at some APIs here. So here I've got an API pulled up for checking air quality. The air quality in northern Nevada right now is awful. We've got fires to the north, we've got fires to the south. I'm a little bit congested because there's just so much smoke. I took the dog for a walk this morning and you could see ashes and particles of ashes just flying around everywhere. I've seen chunks here and there flying around, but as a car drove by me today, there was just a bunch of ashes sort of in the gutter that swept up, and you could see just tons of ash. It's really sad. There's just, the environment is the air quality is just not healthy right now. It's wild. So this is an API for checking the air quality for a given city. So I'm going to copy the URL there, and the first argument to fetch is the URL to which you want to send your API call. I don't need this curl stuff. I'm just going to actually pass the API call. And here we can actually say const city is equal to Sparks, and the state is equal to Nevada. And I'm gonna use string interpolation to put those into our URL here. So the city is going to be the city, and the state is going to be the state, and the country. We'll just stick with U.S. country or U.S. cities because I don't know what other cities or which other countries this API supports. And then we need to pass our API key. And so we're going to say const API key is equal to, and then I have an API key here that I'm going to roll right after this video, so you don't need to copy this. Okay, so this is going to be our call to fetch. Let's actually make this the URL. Const URL is equal to this thing. All right, so we have our fetch call here, and this is going to take in a couple different arguments. So the very first argument is the URL to which we want to send this API call. I also had to switch the state to the full name of the state here, otherwise this doesn't work. So I'm going to pass in the URL to fetch, and this is going to return a promise. So we're going to say const p is equal to this, and for now we'll just console.log p, and we'll take a look at what p looks like in the terminal. So if we refresh the page here, we see that the status of the promise is pending. So this promise is still waiting to resolve when we logged it out, right? And so if we look at this network tab of the terminal and refresh the page, we can see for like a split second. All right, so thinking again about how JavaScript is executing, right? So it's going to execute top to bottom. As soon as it makes that fetch call, that is sort of saying like, go out and fetch some data. And it's in the background, it's going to go fetch the data, and that's going to happen with the browser. But the browser is going to continue executing the JavaScript because fetch is an asynchronous API call. So it's going to return that promise and continue executing. The benefit is that it's not going to lock the browser or prevent us from doing any other actions inside of the browser while it's waiting for that response from the API. As soon as it gets the response from the API, it's going to call that resolve function. It's going to call the resolve function for the promise, passing in any data that came back from the API. And that will cause any of the .then or .catch methods that were attached to the promise to call. So the same way that we had our promise that we called resolve with manually, under the hood, fetch's promise, the resolve method for the promise that fetch is using will be called, and that's going to result in calling .then. So now what we can do is this promise that was returned from fetch, we can now say p.then, and we can pass in a function that we want to call with the results of what came back from the API. So here we might say results, and we can console.log results. Okay, so as soon as that 180 millisecond or whatever the duration is for that API call to happen, as soon as that returns, we're going to console.log results. Before we log results, I'm going to say console.log, like this is before fetch. Then we're going to say after fetch. Then we're going to say before then and after then. And then here we're going to say like got results. So you can sort of see the order in which things are happening here. Okay, so we're going to see, let's talk through the asynchronous like flow for these calls, right? So we're going to console.log before fetch. Then we're going to kick off a call. We're going to tell the browser, hey, go make an API call to this URL and go get some data from that server. And the browser is going to start doing that independently of our code executing. So we're just sort of saying schedule some job to run, and that job is to go fetch some data. And then when you're done scheduling it, come back like immediately. So don't wait for the data to come back immediately. So it's going to come back immediately. Then we're going to log after fetch. Then we're going to log before then. Then we're going to attach this callback, or we're going to attach this success handler to the promise. That's going to say if as soon as the promise is resolved, call this function, but it's not going to actually execute the function at that time. Okay, it's just going to say as soon as that's resolved, we're attaching some code to run as soon as fetch finishes and resolves. So we're still continuing to execute. So we're calling .then and we're passing it this function, and that function is going to be set up as like a thing to do as soon as fetch is done, but it's not going to execute yet. Then we're going to call after then. So it's going to say before fetch, after fetch, before then, after then, and then 180 milliseconds later, might as well be a year later or like an hour later, right? The data is going to come back from the API, and that promise's resolve function is going to get called internally. And when resolve is called, we're going to call all of the callbacks that we have passed to thens. Okay, so let's go take a look. So if we refresh this page, so we see before fetch, before then, after then, and then only after 180 milliseconds later, we see got results. And this is the data that we got back. Okay, so this is results. This response object is the results from the API. So if we look at this response object, it has a few things in here. It has the URL that we called. It has an HTTP status code. This is the 200 status code, means everything was great. Thumbs up. We were not redirected to another endpoint. Okay, status okay, 200. These all mean the same thing. They're all just like helpful ways of breaking down that response. We get some HTTP headers back from the response, and then we have this body. Now, in order to get access to this body, so the body is a readable stream. it turns out that this response object has a method on it called .json. So we can call .json on the response, and that will read all the data that the browser got back. But it turns out that .json also returns a promise. So let's take a look at that. So here we got some results back. We'll say const p2 is equal to results.json. If we console.log p2, you'll see what I mean. So we got some results, and we're going to see what p2 is. I'm going to put this inside of curly braces. This is a shortcut so that we can see p2 points at and then whatever p2 is. This is like a handy trick for console logging. So if we refresh again, now we see p2 points at a promise, and the promise is fulfilled immediately, right? So this is just telling us that when we call .json on the results that were passed to us from the very first fetch call, this JSON returned a promise, and that promise will then again resolve, and it's going to resolve with the JSON object, with the actual JavaScript object. Okay, let's look at it this way first. So we can say results.json.then, and then pass in some other thing like obj. So this is going to be our ultimate like weather object, and that weather object is going to have some data on it. So we'll console.log weather object. Okay, so in this case, I'm chaining .then directly onto the results.json because we know that results.json, when you call results.json, so here we know that results.json is going to return a promise. So as soon as this bit executes, that's going to give us back a promise that we can call .then on. So this is sort of the same as if we had called, if we said like const p2 is equal to results.json and then p2.then. So a shortcut is to just chain .then onto the end of this JSON call because we know JSON returns a promise. So now we're chaining on .then, and as soon as the promise returned from JSON resolves, which will be immediate because we have the data there, it will execute this function that we're passing to then to log out the weather object. So I'm going to again put this inside of these curly braces and refresh the page. So now we see the weather object, and the weather object has the data. Inside of the data, we see, the location, we see the current weather. Inside of the weather, we see a bunch of, oh, here we go. I think this is the air quality indicator, is 242, which is huge. Usually, I think this is supposed to be down like in the 10s or something. And I think if it's over 100, then it's unhealthy. If it's over 200, it's like very unhealthy, or I don't know, something like that. But this gives us like an air quality indication. But this is the data that we wanted back from the API. All right, great. So at least that's working. So we've got this fetch call. It's returning a promise, P. And we talked about here how we can say results.json.then. We can just chain .then directly onto the end. So let's actually refactor our code here so that instead of using P, we're just going to chain .then onto the end of this fetch call. And I'm going to use indentation so that I know that this is sort of like a chained method call. This is a common practice. So there's another trick that we can do though, because then returns a promise. Remember that we can sort of chain a bunch of thens. Down here we said like .then, take a nap, take a nap, take a nap. So they all return promises. So what we can do is we can return results.json as the return value for the first call to .then. And then we can call .then again, we can chain it on there and print out the weather object. I've got a missing U here. So because we're returning results.json, we're returning the promise that comes from here, and that promise is what will be used for the next .then. Okay, so the resolution of .json is going to be what's passed in as the object, the weather object here. So I'm going to remove this console log, and we should just see the weather object now. So now we see the weather object. That's great. We can expand it. We see this success. We see all the data, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. Now, when you're using this arrow function style of function, or this arrow function, like arrow functions inside of JavaScript, one shortcut you can use is a one-liner where you don't have these curly braces. And we talked about this earlier. But when you don't use curly braces, you actually don't have to even pass return. There's an implicit return. So if it's a one-liner like this, so you take in results, and then it's going to, because we don't have curly braces, it knows that it should return whatever this thing is on the right-hand side. So results.json is going to return. The promise for results.json is going to return to this then, and then we'll have access to it down here. Again, we can sort of clean this up and remove these curly braces. So we'll console.log the weather result there. So now we get back the weather object. Again, we see all the data, very cool. Let's actually do something with the data real quick. So let's add, maybe we'll add like a p tag here that has the air quality, and maybe we'll start it off with like 0. And then, so we should see it show 0, and then it'll just flash for just 180 milliseconds. We should be able to detect it with the naked eye. And then as soon as we get this result, we can update that air quality with this weather object. So let's actually like go back to a multi-line string or a multi-line function here. And in order to get the data out of this object too, so we might say like, here we have a JSON object. I'm exploring it sort of from the JavaScript console. And I know that weather object here, I'm expanding it and I can see data, and then I can expand current and I see pollution, and then I expand pollution and I see AQI or whatever. We can also expand weather, and we can see a bunch of stuff about the weather, the temperature, etc. What I want to do is talk about how we dig through this object and call all the different properties to know where we're going. So inside of this data, we want to get the current pollution. So we're going to call .data.current.pollution. So here on the weather object, we should be able to console.log weather object.data.pollution. Or I missed current.pollution. And this should give us back just pollution, and it didn't. So let's see if we can work our way back up. So let's narrow this down. So we'll say weather object.data. That gives us our data. And then if we say .current and refresh, we see the current, and then we see .weather, and then refresh, we see the weather. We actually want pollution. Maybe I spelled it wrong. Okay, so there's the pollution. And then if we want this value here for AQI, I just copied it because I don't know, AQIUS, then we can refresh, and now that's the value that we see. So that's the value that we want to use for our air quality indicator here. So we're going to say document.query selector air quality inner text is equal to AQ, and this should work. All right, so when we refresh the page, you'll be able to see 0 for just a fraction of a second, and then it's going to populate with whatever the current air quality is. So we see 0, boom, it's super quick. And in fact, like we can look at the API calls here and tell exactly how quick it is. So that one took 172 milliseconds. Let's refresh again. Okay, that one took 186 milliseconds. And so the naked eye can detect that, but if you have it, I think if it drops below like 50 milliseconds or something, it's like not detectable with the naked eye. But here we're definitely seeing a flash of 0 followed by the actual value. So in a lot of cases, what you might do is actually type in like loading ... And then when you refresh, you'll see loading while the thing is loading. This is a common practice where if you need to make an AJAX call, so this is sometimes referred to an AJAX call, an asynchronous JavaScript and XML call. It's an asynchronous call out to some web service. We're going to get back some data. When that term was first coined, XML was what you would get back a lot of times instead of JSON. XML is just another format for data. That's another like structure of data. JSON is another object notation or another structure for the data that we get back. Now we mostly work with JSON, but no one has updated it to be AJAG. So it is what it is. But so all to say, when working with promises, you can chain these .thens, and you can also chain a .catch. So it's a common practice to add a .catch and have your reason, and then maybe you want to like actually add that also into the query selector. So we'll say like reason here. So if your API call failed for some reason, then you might want to display that to the user. So instead of just constantly showing loading or something, if you messed up the API request and it failed, or if the server was down, or if for whatever reason we didn't get back the data that we expected, we might want to tell the user the reason for that. So let's actually just like mess up the URL here. So we'll say v2 blah. That's not a valid URL. So now when we refresh, we should get a 404. Why are we not getting any errors from, oh, whoop, I'm missing a closed paren. Oh, I missed my arrow function here. Okay, refresh the page. Okay, here we go. So now our error is showing. So failed to fetch. So we can see this CORS error here, this is failing. v2 blah is not a valid URL. So this is the error that we're going to see. So you could potentially say, like request failed or something like that. So we see loading and then we see request failed. So that is where you would use .catch. I think it is a best practice to always add .catch onto all of your promises. If we were to not have this, then we should see unhandled rejection, unhandled promise rejection. So we see uncaught inside of promise if we don't have the catch there when something is failing. All right, so this is how you use promises. Again, generally you would only use this new promise constructor function to create a new promise if you're like authoring a library or you need to wrap up some asynchronous code that does not already expose a promise. A lot of the times you're going to work with libraries or browser APIs that are going to return promises, and knowing how to handle the results of those promises by adding .then and .catch can be really handy. All right, so that's it for promises. If you found this episode useful at all, I would really appreciate a thumbs up so that other people can find the content. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.